Whispers in the old house. Mark and Lisa had been married for 5 years, and now they were stepping into a new chapter of their lives. Mark, a dedicated software engineer, and Lisa, a passionate freelance graphic designer, had always dreamed of a peaceful home where they could build their future together. When they found an old but spacious house in the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, it felt like fate. The house, built in 1901, had an eerie charm. Its wooden walls whispered stories of the past, and its towering windows stood like silent watchers. The price was surprisingly low, something that should have raised concerns. But Mark, ever the rational thinker, dismissed the idea that cheap houses came with hidden horrors. As they stepped inside, Lisa shivered, an uneasy feeling washing over her. "Mark, do you feel that?" she whispered, rubbing her arms. "It's like we're being watched." Mark chuckled, pressing a reassuring kiss to her forehead. "It's just your imagination, Lisa. Old houses creak, and the air feels different. Trust me, once we settle in, you'll love it." She nodded hesitantly, but deep down something gnawed at her, a feeling of unseen eyes, of something lurking just beyond her vision. As they unpacked, Lisa's gaze landed on the portraits lining the hallway. The faces, old, unfamiliar, seemed to watch them, their hollow eyes following their every move. The air inside felt thick, heavy, as if the house itself was breathing. Then came the whispers, faint, indistinct, almost like the wind through cracked walls. Lisa shook her head. She was just overthinking, right? The unseen guest. That night, Mark tossed and turned, sleep evading him. The room felt unnaturally cold, the kind of chill that seeped into his bones. Then, just as he was drifting off, a sound sent ice through his veins. Footsteps, slow, measured, climbing the stairs. Mark's breath hitched, his mind raced. Lisa must have gone downstairs for water, but when he turned to check, she was right there, curled up under the blanket, breathing softly, his stomach twisted. If Lisa was here, then who was walking upstairs? His pulse thundered in his ears as he reached for his phone, the dim glow of the flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Step by step, he approached the staircase, and then he saw it. At the bottom of the stairs, a shadow stood, tall, still, watching. Mark's heart pounded so hard it hurt. The flashlight beam trembled in his shaking hand as he pointed it toward the figure, and in an instant, it vanished. A sharp breath left his lips. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, just his sleep-deprived mind playing games. But deep down, he knew something was here. Returning to bed, he willed himself to ignore the creeping fear clawing at his chest. But just as he closed his eyes, scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound came from beneath the bed. Lisa stirred slightly but didn't wake. Mark's throat went dry. The scratching continued, slow, deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. Gathering every ounce of courage, he bent down and peered under the bed. Nothing, just darkness. But the fear didn't leave, because something inside him whispered, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. The first glimpse. The next evening, Lisa was alone in the kitchen, trying to shake off the unease that had clung to her since last night. She focused on dinner, humming softly to calm herself. Then she saw it, scratches, deep, jagged marks running down the refrigerator door, marks that had not been there before. Her heart clenched. "Mark!" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Then, movement. A flicker of shadow in her peripheral vision. Lisa spun around, chest heaving. The kitchen was empty, yet the air felt thick, charged with something unseen. A cold dread settled in her stomach. Just then, Mark entered, noticing her pale face. "Lisa, what's wrong?" Before she could answer, the lights above them flickered violently. One by one, the cabinet doors burst open, slamming so hard the walls trembled. Lisa gasped, clutching Mark's arm. He held her close, his own breath uneven. And then, silence. A suffocating, heavy silence. Mark's fingers dug into Lisa's hand as he whispered, Lisa were not alone. She already knew, because somewhere in the house, something was listening. Mark and Lisa stood frozen, their bodies stiff with terror. Mark hesitantly reached out, pushing the cabinet doors shut. But the moment he withdrew his hands, bang! The doors burst open again with even more force, as if something unseen was defying him. Lisa let out a strangled scream, clutching Mark's arm. What's happening, Mark? Mark turned his gaze toward the antique clock hanging on the wall. His stomach twisted. The hands had stopped. 3:03 a.m. Lisa's voice quivered. "We need to leave this house, Mark. Please." Mark swallowed hard. The fear in Lisa's eyes was real, tangible, but still a part of him refused to believe, refused to accept that something beyond his understanding was at play. And that was his first mistake. Behind the locked door, the next morning Lisa noticed something strange. The upstairs room, the one they had never locked, was now shut from the inside. Lisa's voice was barely above a whisper. "That door was open before, Mark." Mark frowned and tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. He pressed his shoulder against it, but it didn't move an inch. A sudden unease settled in his chest. Frustrated, he hurried downstairs, grabbed an old iron rod, and forced the lock open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing the dimly lit room. Lisa gasped, stepping back. The room was filled with old, dust-covered furniture, but what sent ice through their veins was the walls. Deep scratch marks covered every inch, hundreds of them, etched in chaotic, desperate strokes. Shapes of hands, faces frozen in silent screams. And in the center of the room, a wooden rocking chair, moving, slowly, back and forth. Lisa's breath came in shallow gasps. "We shouldn't be here, Mark." Mark, however, stepped forward, drawn in by an invisible force. Suddenly, the chair stopped, and in the deafening silence that followed, a hand landed on Mark's shoulder. "It's here!" Mark spun around, his heart slamming against his ribs. No one was there, but Lisa wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked on the mirror behind him, her face drained of all color. "Mark!" Her voice broke. "Turn around." Dread clawed its way up his spine as he turned, and saw her. A woman stood inside the mirror. Her hollow eyes, sunken into dark pits, stared straight at him. Her lips were cracked, blood trailing from the corners, and as she raised her trembling hand toward the glass, the surface rippled like water. Mark stumbled back, his chest heaving. But before he could react, the door slammed shut behind them. Lisa rushed to it, pulling at the handle. Locked, trapped, and then the woman tilted her head. A shrill, ear-piercing scream erupted from her throat as she lunged, straight through the glass. The fight to escape. The walls shook, vibrating with whispers. A chorus of tortured voices filled the air. "This is my home. You do not belong here." Mark and Lisa ran for the door, but just as Mark reached for the handle, something slammed into him with brutal force. He crashed to the floor, his body convulsing as if something unseen was trying to pull him away. Lisa screamed, gripping his arm. "Mark, get up!" But Mark's body wasn't his own anymore. His limbs stiffened, his breath came in ragged gasps. His fingers twitched unnaturally, as though something else was inside him, fighting for control. Lisa gathered every ounce of strength she had and yanked him forward. With one last desperate shove, she forced the door open, and they tumbled out of the room. The final blow. They ran, down the hall, down the stairs, through the front door. They didn't stop until they collapsed on the cold ground outside. Lisa clutched her chest, gasping for breath. Mark sat up slowly, hands trembling. And then they looked back. The house stood still, silent, like nothing had happened. But just as they exhaled in relief, a shadow shifted in the upstairs window. Lisa's blood ran cold. The woman stood there watching, and then she smiled. The front doors slammed shut with a thunderous bang. The windows darkened, and the house went silent once more. The end, or not. Mark and Lisa never stepped foot inside that house again. Days later, they uncovered the truth. In 1920, A woman had lived there with her husband, suffering years of abuse. One night she disappeared. Some say she was murdered. Some say she took her own life. But one thing was certain: she never left, and no one who stayed in that house ever survived.